Hello, everyone. I have something to share with you today. Let me pull it up. Okay, so this is titled, How Am I Still a Christian? A Testimony. And I'm going to be reading it to you from a document I made. All right. I'm about to share with you what I consider to be the most important thing in my life, which is the story of my relationship with God. If that statement made you cringe and want to click the next video, you've come to the right place because it does the same to me. I grew up hearing that phrase, and it made me cringe then. This is because the word God brings up feelings, whether you believe in one or not. And isn't that interesting? Whether you believe in him or not, you have opinions about him. The reason I worded the title the way I did is because my views on God have radically changed from how they started out. College, church, childhood, philosophy club, secular friend groups, friends leaving the same faith we grew up in, and some really difficult life experiences challenged my view of God and my seriousness about faith. Unlike your usual testimonies, where there's a before you met Christ, the moment you're saved, and then how your life has been ever since, mine is more of a journey. I'm afraid I'm one of those people who has always been rather skeptical and needs things to be proven to me, frustratingly deep levels sometimes. Over the course of my life, I've seen God do many things, but for the sake of time, this testimony focuses on the big three and how the results became the foundations of my belief. Why am I going to tell you this? Well, it was actually God's idea that I tell you my story. 2 years ago, I was at a really low point, working a low rung job, frustrated with how I wasn't doing anything meaningful, and feeling stuck and boxed in by life. I asked God if there was anything worthwhile that I could do, and He dropped this idea into my head. It has taken me, actually, over a year to write this. Um, and that's because I haven't been in the habit of sharing these stories with people. I also procrastinated because I was terrified of being this vulnerable with you all. This collection of stories from my life illustrates my evolution of faith in God. Taking a page out of the Joyce Myers book, the word testimony begins with the word test. So I guess you could say the three great tests of my life so far have been depression, death, and despair. They have made me who I am today. Okay, so that was a long prologue, if you will. So without further ado, strap in for the most important story of my life. The beginning. The first time I remember really becoming aware of the concept of God was when I was 6 years old. We were driving home from the library one night, and my older sister was telling me God could do anything. Skeptical, I asked, You mean he could turn me into a chicken? We debated on whether or not that would actually happen, but eventually she conceded that yes, if he wanted to, he could. Dumbfounded, I decided to believe in him on the spot. I guess something about the omnipotence of God at the age of 6 really resonated with me. I grew up in a classic, conservative, large, homeschooled Christian family. We did religious things like go to church all the time, have Bible studies most days of the week, and attend many, many VBS babysitting services. If you know, you know. We also went through a rigorous theology type club called Awana for about 10 years, and I was raised in a very sheltered way. Think VeggieTales, worship music, Angel Wings, Saxon, My Father's World. Basically, no one can ever blame my parents for even slightly allowing pollution to enter our young minds. So the first time I met depression, I had no idea what I was going through. I actually didn't learn about the word until I was 13. Depression. Let me tell you a few things about depression. It's a completely different reality and worldview than whatever a regular one is. It comes with its own special list of symptoms like feeling dread or fear all the time, crying yourself to sleep, spending an exorbitant amount of time dwelling on negative things, chronic overthinking, feeling profoundly empty and lonely all the time, feeling and being misunderstood, wanting to be invisible, and always hiding your emotions and isolating from people. I was 12. After dealing with all this for a while, I unlocked level 2 of depression, suicidal ideation. Sometimes I really contemplated dying and what it would be like, and how one could go about doing it. I would also wonder about the point of life and the point of my existence. I know, rather intense for a 12-year-old. Most people are shocked to learn that young kids can feel that much. Fun fact, adults don't know as much as they think they do. I found that kids who have these existential crises at this age are usually deep thinkers and care a lot about the truth. As life would have it, depression and I would become an on again, off again relationship. So, how did I pull out of round one? Well, I found a verse in the Bible that said, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." That's from James 1. And I was constantly in situations I didn't know how to handle, so I often prayed for wisdom. Turns out, God really did come through on that prayer and taught me many things through a unique devotion book and a preacher named Joyce Myers. Here's two lessons I learned from all of that fundamentally changed my thinking. Number one, at some point in your life, you will desperately need help, and every single person you turn to will fail you. Humans are fallible, so trusting them is dumb. Turn to God instead. So there's a couple verses that kind of lend to that. Cursed is the man who makes flesh his strength. No, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength. That's in Jeremiah. And the second one is, it is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. There's a healthy way to take this concept and an unhealthy way. Just want to put that out there. The second thing I learned was that perspective can make the unbearable bearable. God taught me that changing how you look at or understand something can change how you feel about it, and thus you can live in less distress. This lesson has been the mantra of my life ever since. Unfortunately, I took the first lesson and kind of ran with it. Cut to high school, where I started working on my self sufficiency because, I can't trust people. I didn't even trust God a bunch, but I did trust myself. So I worked on independence and relying only on me for my emotional and mental stability and happiness. Naturally, I became even more lonely, and even though I had many friends, I never opened up, and I would shrink back if I ever felt like I was getting too close to anyone. My journal was my best friend, and I was bound for more depression spells, because here's another life truth: there is no growth where there is no vulnerability. I was 16 when I had my second depression episode. I was exhausted all the time. I didn't look forward to anything, and I always felt like crying. But I didn't because I had appearances to keep up. Otherwise, someone would start to think something was wrong and start investigating and insist on helping and then make my life even worse. I told God I didn't feel like living. And if this was going to be the way things were, then I would systematically go through all the major world religions, and if none of them helped me, then I would quit life. At this point, I had a good basic understanding of some other major worldviews like Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, nihilism, postmodernism, pantheism, etc., thanks to Awana. I decided to start with Christianity because I knew the most about it. I went into some deep research on how Christianity was different from other religions and what its answer was to the purpose of life. I would also message a lot of depressed people on Instagram asking why they were depressed and what was their purpose for living. I'm not sure how I got through that second phase of depression, but it began to instill the fear in me that something was fundamentally wrong with me, like mental health wise. One good thing did come from all of it, however. I became convinced that the purpose of life is love. People lived for love and they died for it, or from the lack of it. The conclusion to this season of my life was that because I endured with God through all this, I developed a baby, semi strong relationship with Him, which is what kept me from initially ditching Him in college. Let's jump to college. I'm going to take a little detour here to fill you in on a couple stories that added important beliefs to my worldview before I dive into the next foundation stone, death. By the time I went to college, I was ready for adventure, independence, and friends who weren't Christians. I was sick of Christians. Not Christianity, just Christians. I had gained fabulous firsthand experience in legalistic, judgmental, and hypocritical Christian atmospheres. It may surprise you, but godliness wasn't something I wanted. I wasn't impressed with the people in church whom others labeled as godly. I didn't covet their lives or their worldview, and I didn't want to be like them. So in college, I tried going to many different denominations, but I never remained interested. I didn't fit in. I was looking for real and kept finding two faced and complacent duty. I'd see students at a party the night before doing things their mothers would faint over, and then watch them show up to church the next morning. Because I didn't find real and deep in the church, I joined a philosophy club, and man, I grew so much because of them. I would argue and wrestle and even truly doubt the existence of God. We had discussions about how an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God could allow suffering, or objective versus subjective truth and morality, or could God make a rock heavier than he could lift, and the concept of hell. The president of the club was something of an arrogant a hole. And though we became pretty good friends, I started to realize that most people in the group just like airing their opinions and got high off of debate. I liked debate too, but I liked finding truth and answers more. My dad had actually instilled that in me at a very early age, which is kind of invaluable. Turns out, they weren't really there to find answers. I learned an important lesson about love, truth, and people that semester, and the answer came from Pastor Jim. I shared with him how I'd attempted to defend the existence of God to my philosophy friends and how it seemed like they got high off the conversation and didn't care about the conclusions. And he told me, relationship is far more important than logic. Relationship changes people, not logic. You will probably disagree with that statement. I know I did, but I tucked it in my pocket as a theory and decided to test it. Eventually, I did find it to be true. There was a guy in the group who told me once he really appreciated how I treated our mutual a hole friend, and that even though he didn't agree with my opinion, he respected my thoughts and arguments and my ability to listen, which had been instilled in me by my mother. It blew my mind that I had the respect of an atheist for how I debated, as well as the logic behind my thoughts. And I started to realize maybe Jim was right. Maybe relationships really are more important in the end than logic. The second story is at some point, I decided to take a break from Christianity. I was sick of feeling pressured and stressed and guilty for not praying or reading my Bible as much as I should, and not being disciplined and Christianly in general. God had been silent for a while, and I was frustrated. I also had a lot of ideas about God and what I thought He wanted from me. These obligations weren't appealing, interesting, or attractive, and it got to the point where I couldn't stand the thought of being a godly person, whatever that was. So I decided to take a break and find some peace by doing whatever the hell I wanted. I remember being so excited about that thought, thinking the world was open to me and there were no more rules or condemnation to make me feel less than or failing or unholy. But funny enough, every time I tried to do something against my core value system, I felt less free and more anxious. And when it came right down to it, I simply couldn't. I then realized that my value system was baked into me like a cake. And then one day, God plopped this thought in my head: why don't you try forgetting everything you think you know about me and what I expect of you? And from then on, I started putting God's character on trial. And that is one of the best, most freeing things I've ever done. He started reshaping what my idea of good was, and my worldview once again started to radically change. Now we've arrived at the second experience that greatly challenged my faith, and it only took me 3 months to figure out how to write it. You guessed it, death. It began at the end of my freshman year when I met a new friend named Jake. You know, when you meet someone and you instantly know, ah, yes, this is a cool person, and you just click as people, and you can't wait to get to know them better? That was Jake. It was everything from his smile to his superior listening skills. He was dressed cool. He was cool. He was super attractive. He was significantly higher than me in the social ranks, and surprisingly, he genuinely cared about people, which is rare to come across. The second time we saw each other, I waved hello, and he came over and sat down beside me and said, "Sup, homie?" This meant a lot to me because I was one of those people that was always caring more about others than they did about me, and many times people wouldn't remember me after we met. So, as one does, I developed a massive crush on him. Once I jokingly squealed to my roommates, "I'm in love!" Throughout the summer, I would periodically stalk his Facebook, which did nothing to further my attachment. What? He's an artist? He sings? He plays the guitar? He loves skateboards? He's a hip hop dancer? Needless to say, I was so excited for school to start up and then make this guy my friend. Jump forward to first semester, sophomore year. The first week of school had ended, and I was scrolling through Facebook and saw a post of him and a friend that apparently had just died. After seeing four more posts with the same content but a different friend in each picture, I realized that he had died and that it was by suicide. I went into shock for a while. I kept thinking, shouldn't I be crying? Shouldn't this bother me? Wait, is he really dead? How can he be dead? How is it him? And thus began the worst year of college for me. Not only did I struggle academically that year more than any other, but I met grief for the first time, and boy, did my world turn upside down. Once again, I cried myself to sleep every night for months. I'd also just cry at random inconvenient times in general, like in class or in a canoe on a canoe trip. I would wonder how people could laugh, or if I'd ever be happy again. I would think about how fragile my own life was, and if I'd randomly get hit by a car and die, or if one of my friends or family would die unexpectedly. Nothing seemed stable, certain, or predictable, and I wondered how it was that people made plans for their lives and finances or careers when literally anything could happen at any moment. The world was very scary and uncontrollable to me at that time. The fact that it was by suicide made it worse because I knew about depression. I was also angry at him for a while because I knew in my bones there were so many good things ahead and he had just wasted the rest of his life. If you are listening to this and feeling detached and off, kind of uncomfortable, like you can't understand it at all, I'd like you to understand that this isn't the regular reality people live with in their heads, but it is a reality and it is very real. So I just want to say discomfort is a proper response. There shouldn't be such a thing as death, but there is. And it's terribly important not to take things for granted. Okay, jumping back to the night after I learned about Jake. I was so mentally and emotionally wrecked with all of this that it became unbearable. It was 2 a.m. and I needed answers. I walked all the way across campus to a Christian house that was open 24/7. I don't know why I felt like I needed to go there. I just couldn't be in my room. Alone with a lamp in the silent living room, I poured out my heart to God, asking him to help me understand all of this. Situations like this throw heaven, hell, and salvation under a microscope. And I was wondering how I could live believing in hell and the conclusion that some people must go there. And what if it's someone you love? How stupid and arrogant and unfeeling that doctrine felt. How could people preach this so easily? Just want to be clear, I didn't know anything about Jake's beliefs. These questions were just brought on by the situation and hypotheticals. There was also another thing I was wrestling with that I didn't know at the time, and that was what God wanted to deal with first. As I sat there, numb, I saw this loose screw on the side table. Absent-mindedly, I picked it up and noticed the notched top in the shape of a cross. After studying it a while, John 3:16 floated through my head. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I started having a series of thoughts. The cross in the screw, the cross that Jesus died on, the screw in my hand, the nails in Jesus' hands, Jesus' anguish for the pain and suffering in the world, his wanting to stop it, his decision to sacrifice himself so that people would not have to die. Jesus didn't want people to die. He doesn't want death. And then I could feel God crying with me. He gave me this picture in my head that he was just as heartbroken as I was about all this. I think he didn't stop Jake's death because he has a different rule book than us, but by golly, if he could have, he would have, I think. And then it clicked. The point of life is love. People need hope to live, and hope comes from love. People desperately needed love, and the point of my life was to show it to them, not to fix them, not to save them, just to love them and to point them to the one who is love. Every person, even people I disliked, because this goes beyond like and dislike. It's far bigger and more important than how I feel. I decided right then and there that no matter how inconvenient or how exhausted I was, no matter what time of the day or night, I would sacrifice whatever I needed to show people love and to bring them to the truth. There's a verse that says, "Now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love." So this lesson didn't take away the pain of Jake's tragedy, but it did help me get through it. I found a ring on the sidewalk that night and wore it for many years to remind myself of all of this. And so began my journey of learning about love and how to love best. Let's just say I've had so many ideologies broken about what love is and what it looks like in situations. For instance, sometimes love isn't mere kindness. Sometimes love looks like harm and feels painful, i.e., breaking a bone to set it right, which leads me perfectly to my last and most recent experience with God: despair. The last and most recent experience that shook my faith in God revolves around the word despair. Despair means the complete loss or absence of hope. This came about in two stages over the course of a year. The first phase happened when I'd been unemployed for 8 months. This was partly due to COVID and partly because of the futility that is job searching online. Here's why this took a toll on me. Unemployment alone is rough. At first, I had been selective in my job search. People around me had expectations for what kind of job I ought to have now that I was a college graduate with a decent degree. But as the months wore on and nothing worked, I became desperate for anything. I began to not be able to pay for my rent, and then my bills, and then groceries, which is quite humiliating and frustrating for the ambitious, responsible types. Also, I don't know if you've noticed it, but it's very anti American to receive charity. And Christians also suck at receiving help. I'd gone through various levels of panic watching my bank account shrink to the point where I was relying completely on the charity of my sister to live. And the longer it went on, the more I owed her. I felt like a financial burden. Couple that with 8 months of job rejection, and I felt unwanted and quite useless. Slowly, one by one, my ambitions, my dreams, my hope, my identity, my motivation, and my energy left the building. I spent a lot of time walking around in parks because there's something about nature that helps you forget about yourself and your problems. I'd also spend a lot of time sleeping because I didn't want to be conscious. Life was too hard to do awake. Unfortunately, somehow, sleeping all the time morphed into me being tired all the time and not being able to sleep. Life is cruel. So sometimes I would just lay in bed and stare at nothing for long periods of time. I didn't want to kill myself, but I didn't want to do the game of life anymore either. To sum it up, I didn't know who I was or what I was supposed to be doing, and my worth and value as a person were completely in the dust. Okay, so point taken. I was miserable. I had no idea there was so much more at play that was making me feel the way I did. So let me tell you what I figured out much, much later. The worldview of the world. Business school, and just kind of the world in general, indoctrinate you with a set of beliefs on how to do life correctly or how not to be a disappointment. These expectations have to do with identity and success. So let me break it down for you. Identity. When people first meet you, they usually ask you three questions. Number one, what do you do for a living? Number two, what do you want to do, like your dreams and ambitions? And number three, what is your relationship status? And so by these three questions in the back of your head, you can start to understand that like these are how people define you, aka your identity. Success is subtly measured behind the scenes and is measured based off of the answers you give to these three questions. So, for example, when someone asks you, "What do you do for a living?" they're also thinking, "What's the significance of your job?" And like, how much job security do you have? Do you have a 401k? Are there benefits? Like, will you keep this job for a long time? Will you be moving up in it? Or is it a dead end job? These are success factors. For the second question, what do you want to do? Like your dreams and ambitions. They're also thinking about your financial independence and its security. And then for the third question, what's your relationship status? People usually measure that by, is it moving to long term? Do you look like you're moving in a direction that you'd get married or have kids or blah, 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 blah. So your worth and value are tied to your identity, and your identity is tied to your success. Therefore, if you're not being successful, you are worthless. This is why some people are accomplishment and productivity driven, and why they get in a bad way if they aren't producing or achieving things. There's also milestones in life that have age completion expectations, like dating, having a good job, marriage, having kids, buying a house, investing, having financial independence and security. And if you're not checking these off, you're going to start feeling like a failure by the standards of society. College has this idea that you're supposed to be on your way to success in your mid 20s, and your relatives expect the same regarding your relationship status. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it takes half a lifetime to figure out what you want to do. And sometimes what you think you want to do doesn't end up being what you like. And sometimes people change careers multiple times. The world looks down on that, by the way, unless you're successful. The problem was, I didn't know all this was baked into my subconscious, and that this worldview was dictating the value I placed on myself and therefore my emotional state. This was the first phase of despair I went through. The second phase happened after I finally got a new job. Understandably, I was extraordinarily eager to help people and be useful and do things and make people proud of me so I could be proud of myself. Because previously, I thought I was failing at life. At first, the job did help fix things. I'd been given an enormous amount of responsibility and a larger salary than I'd ever have. But then, as you probably already have guessed, some things started going wrong. The problem. Okay, so first of all, I was the only employee at this job. There was no other. The person who trained me knew very little about how things worked and where things were located. And so there were days that I would spend hours trying to figure out what I was supposed to do and how I was supposed to do it. I created whole systems and schedules and prediction models for myself to make things easier. But I also wasted hours going down wrong rabbit holes. I wore all of the hats except that of owner. So I was making the product, packaging it, loading and unloading, delivering, cleaning up. I ran all aspects of event planning and the company food truck business all by myself, too. I was maintenance, I was janitor, I ordered supplies, took inventory. I did all the administration work as well as some accounting and licensing. I was in charge of creating and maintaining the many marketing platforms and going on sales calls and basically anything that needed to be done to run a business, I was doing it. Occasionally, I worked for and did projects for my boss's other businesses. I began having issues with my boss because he wouldn't believe me, or he wouldn't agree with me on things I thought were problematic, or he was too microscopic and couldn't zoom out to see the big picture. He also never told me if I was doing anything right or well, but he would tell me when he thought things were not up to par. He thought that needing encouragement meant that you lacked confidence. Suffice to say, this job was completely impossible to keep up with, and I began to understand why the previous manager I never met had up and disappeared one day. Naturally, because of all this, I developed some symptoms, you might say. A constant feeling of dread, frequent headaches, usually crying on the car ride home, a change in personality while at work. I pulled back and didn't confide in people anymore. I stayed in my room whenever I wasn't working. I didn't want to talk or socialize. It was too exhausting. Plus, I didn't want to talk about my situation and how hopeless it was. I was living in depression and despair. It's like when something bad happens, even if it's just a little bad thing, it lays you out flat. Trip on a sidewalk, lay down and give up. A pebble flies out and hits you, bing, you go unconscious. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, "The human spirit can endure in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear?" And that is what despair is like. And once again, you are questioning your will to live. So that is how I felt. Here's what my life philosophy looked like. If you had asked me what I believed about the world, I would have told you: one, life is pain. Two, enjoy the hell out of the good times because the bad ones are just right around the corner. Three, if you don't expect anything good, you won't be disappointed, which is an absolute lie. But anyway. Four, the amount of bad days I've had in life far outweigh the good ones. And five, life is always conspiring against me. To some of you listeners, it's probably obvious by now that I should have quit. Some of the reasons I hadn't were because for the longest time I thought it was all me. I had no one to talk to who understood what I was going through, and I hadn't developed much confidence in myself at that point, so I assumed I was the problem and I just needed to get better. Another reason was because I had stupidly agreed very early on to work this job for a minimum of 9 months. I am someone who takes the integrity of my word very seriously. If I hadn't agreed, I was given the impression that I'd be let go. And lastly, I felt like it would be ungrateful and wrong to leave a job that I felt in my bones that God had provided for me. I then developed one more symptom that threw me over the edge. I began having these sensations where I'd hear something and my brain would repeat the sound louder and faster, over and over, and very aggressively, and my heart would start beating fast, and I couldn't control any of it. The only way to get rid of this was to lay down on my back in a very quiet place and practice controlled breathing for as long as 10 to 20 minutes and try not to think about it. I thought I was developing schizophrenia, but thankfully, a couple days of research explained I was experiencing the phenomenon of derealization, which is brought on by chronic anxiety, and that the longer this continued, the harder it would be to get rid of. And there you have it. I'd finally reached the point where my life was unbearable, my job was unbearable, my mind was unbearable, and something had to change and soon. Mind you, I had been asking God for help all along. I was doing everything I knew how to be okay. Every morning, I woke up early and I went on a walk or a run, and I had a devotion, and I listened to worship songs, and I tried to eat healthy. And while God would send me little answers every now and then, He was silent for a very long time. This made me question the goodness of God. Why didn't he give me a break? Why didn't he give me answers? Why didn't he grant me the comfort of his nearness? I wasn't as good of a sufferer as Job. I questioned God's character and demanded answers, and he was silent. My deliverance came about in two ways. The first was literally, and the second was mentally and spiritually. So, the first, literally, as I mentioned before, the derealization phenomenon sent me over the edge. I began seriously contemplating leaving. I finally decided I needed a wiser person's opinion, and so I called up a woman I hadn't talked to in years. I actually didn't know her that well, but I highly respected her because once I had been in a bad way, and she had seen me and reached out of her own accord and insisted on helping me. So I took the giant leap of courage and called her, explaining the situation and how I didn't want to disappoint God. She listened completely and asked good questions, and then, like a gust of fresh air through the back door, she explained a different version of God than the one I had in my head and advised me that leaving was the right thing to do. I then started preparing to quit. I didn't know it at the time, but this would be one of the second hardest things I had ever done in my life. It took me 2 weeks of hard scrutiny, deep introspection, script writing, and speech prep to finally feel ready. And boy, am I glad I did all of that work because the actual quitting interview was not pretty. And if I hadn't already thought through all of my reasons and had confidence in myself, I would have left that meeting feeling like a screwed up failure at life who had no future. But thankfully, with God's help, I was able to remain gracious and generous and unwavering. So the second way I was liberated mentally and spiritually. A couple months before all this, I had finally realized I was depressed when I walked into my favorite store, Barnes& and Noble, and not one thing piqued my interest. In fact, instead of having my curiosity heightened by all the things, they just made me feel overwhelmed and completely exhausted. As my sister and I went through the aisles, I pointed out the book Green Lights and told her it was a newly popular book. For some reason, she bought it. Well, I'd been reading Green Lights around the time I quit, and in the book, the author, Matthew McConaughey, claims he's never felt like a victim before. That concept alone took me a whole day to process. Because while I was resolute in taking responsibility for the bad things that life threw my way, I still blamed life. I had always felt like a victim. I lived under the feeling that life was conspiring against me, and it got me wondering if it was possible for someone to switch and think like him. And then Matthew McConaughey mentioned another thing he believed, that life was like a bunch of green lights and red lights. Green lights are things that mean proceed, carry on, go, advance, approval, support, praise, joy, health, success. They say yes and give us what we want. They're easy. We like green lights. And then there's yellow and red lights that say things like no or slow down, take caution, detour, interruption, a pause, sickness, pain, suffering, an intervention, a full stop, failure, a slap in the face, death. He believed every red light would eventually turn green, that red lights lead you to green lights, and that you can get better at hitting more greens than reds, and that sometimes green lights are disguised as red lights. He believed that life conspired to help him. I thought, sure, that's easy because that's been your experience. Or that's easy to believe because that's been your experience. But the concept grew on me, and one day in my living room, God gave me a revolutionary thought. I realized that me and Matthew believed the same thing, but the difference between our ideologies was the slightest shift in our perspectives. The slightest shift. And that shift made all the difference. Life is reds and greens, but I focused on the reds and he focused on the greens. He believed that you could get better at reds, which translated to me, you can get better at doing suffering, which was a thought I had never heard or thought about in my life. And then God dropped a picture in my head. There were two trains racing alongside each other, headed the same way. One was black and one was silver. The black represented dark logic, very reasonable, very logical, and practical. The silver train represented light logic and was also reasonable and logical and practical. The only difference between them was that light logic allowed for the unknown variable in its equation, and the dark logic did not. On the light logic train, the unknown variable represented hope. I realized I'd been living on the dark train. Here's what that experience is like, if you're curious. You believe that this logic makes the most sense, dark logic. People will say you're pessimistic and you'll believe you're just realistic. While you're alive, you're living miserably and hopelessly. The conclusions to your predictions are always negative, and you always end up being right. You don't allow for an unknown variable, and you certainly don't allow room for hope. From the dark logic perspective, the light logic train looks silly, and hope seems unreasonable, childish, and highly unlikely. Statistics laugh at it. But I suddenly realized that while they were both logical, instinctively, Siri thought I was talking to her. Hang on. Siri, stop. Okay. Okay, where was I? Oh, but suddenly I realized that while they were both logical, instinctively I knew the light train was more right. Because A, humans are flawed, And it's stupid to think you can know the outcome of a prediction absolutely. And B, because the dark train leads to death. Quite literally, it makes you so miserable you want to die. Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life." And what that means to me in this context is that the cost of thinking in the dark realm is death. But life is the gift of God. And so if you're thinking on the light logic train, it brings you life. It doesn't make you want to die. So I then realized that I needed to get off the dark train and onto the light, but I didn't know how. The phrase, a leap of faith, flitted through my brain. And I knew it was from God, but I didn't know how to take a leap of faith. I didn't know how to just switch my thinking from one opposite to the other. And I didn't know how to think correctly. So I ended by telling God I just wanted to. Little by little, God started offering me different ways to think. When good would happen to me, He opened my eyes to see it. And down the road, He challenged me to believe it. So quick and radical was this change in me that 1 week after the whole quitting ordeal, I had an experience that shocked me. One evening, while I was taking a walk in the park, I was so stunned by the beauty around me that I silently thanked God for putting up with the world long enough to let me live in it, and that stopped me cold, just in my tracks, because I remembered just a week before asking God why on earth He had let me be born into this miserable world in the first place. I struggled for a while afterwards with believing in the goodness of God. I'd been through such an ordeal and had so many new scars that I couldn't find a reason that would justify all the suffering I'd went through. I really am a person who has been to rock bottom like multiple times. It's not like oh, I have experienced rock bottom once. Yeah, like I've been there. No, I literally lived there for like many points throughout my life. I am very familiar with how deep that pit is. But anyway, so I was upset at God for going silent. And when He finally delivered me, I was upset that He did it with such seemingly random timing. I knew that the Christian life was supposed to be full of trials, but my goodness, I thought God was supposed to be with me through all of it. It took me a couple years to realize that in order to live the life that Paul details in Philippians, and this is what it details, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. In order to live that life and have it become a reality for me, I had to learn 3 lessons. The first is I had to come into a deeper understanding of God's character. The second is I needed to learn some big lessons on how to look at life through the eyes of faith. And 3, I needed to learn, like, intellectually believe things to the point where they started affecting my emotions and the way I felt. There's a verse in Romans that explains this pretty well. We can rejoice, too, when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And I think that's salvation of like anything, not just like eternal salvation. And this hope will not lead to disappointment. For we know how dearly God loves us, because He has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with His love. One major lesson I learned was that was what it really means to have your identity be in Christ. So here's 3 things also that shaped my understanding of this. Number 1, I hate owing people. It is a direct violation of self sufficiency, which is the thing that protects me. So when my finances dropped below my panic now boundary, I had many depressed and anxiety ridden days until I learned that I was relying on my finances to keep me safe and provide and protect me, and not God. My next project was to figure out how to get my emotions aligned with my belief system, aka how to keep my protection, safety, and provision in God and not my finances. At one point, I had no job, no hope, no dreams or goals, and nothing was working. I didn't know who I was, and let me be clear when I say this is a personal kind of hell to be a super ambitious person with no goals, aim, or direction. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, "Desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will hasty feet miss the way?" And all that Bible school crap about you're a child of God and your identity is hidden in Christ, man, absolutely zilched me. Like, what do those phrases even mean anyway? I grew up hearing about and how my identity was in Christ. And to a certain extent, yes, being a Christian does help define you, but what does it mean? And what does it look like to live in that identity? What does that identity even mean? So I got the idea to do an in depth study on the character of God and what he said about himself, and then what he thought about me. And that was actually how I found my identity. And it brought back my hope. I learned I tied my worth as a person to my identity, and I tied my identity to success. And my definition of success was uncontrollable. Therefore, I needed to redefine it to something that was controllable. But what could that be? I asked God what his definition of success was and got various answers. After a long while of seeking, I came to find out that devoting myself to God, loving him and loving others was all God wanted from me in life. It was my core meaning of life, which means if I'm unemployed and on my last dime, or if I'm in prison, or if life is going perfectly, if I'm devoting myself to Christ, I am winning. Here's a couple verses that like illustrate that. Matthew says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." And then Psalm says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." The last and most important lesson I learned was that where there is no vulnerability, there is no growth, which means it takes being truthful with yourself and God and others in order to grow and overcome something. It takes extreme courage to be vulnerable, and it takes extreme strength not to beat yourself up after being vulnerable. God works in truth, and vulnerability is the truth. The Bible says the truth will set you free. The reason why we beat ourselves up after revealing the truth about ourselves to others is because in the end, we still care about what they think of us and how they will react. Will they treat me differently now that they know the truth? Will they look down on me? Will they think less of me? Will they even care? But the thing is, when you truly care more about what God thinks of you, you can rest in the knowledge that He is proud of you and it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. I mean, I haven't been 100% with you all. I haven't told you what first caused my 2 depression spells, and there's some other really hard things I've been through that I still haven't totally processed and don't know how to talk about. But I've seen God work miracles through these things as well. And sometimes you just have to start with what you have and where you're at. Vulnerability brings growth, and growth brings healing, and healing brings life. It has been an enormous exercise in vulnerability to share all of this with you all, but I know without a shadow of doubt that God wanted me to do this, and it gives me all the strength and comfort to know that. I will now end by saying that for the last 2 years, God has taken me on a crazy healing journey. I have not been depressed or even had the feeling of depression once in these last 2 years, which is the longest I have ever gone without it. There is a noticeable difference in the way I think and handle crises now. I have seen a giant change in my thinking patterns. I've literally gotten better at suffering. I know that there will be more hard times and tragedies ahead, but I'm not afraid because now I truly believe in the goodness of God and in the life He wants us to live. So, to end all of this, I have some verses that helped like form my mentality um, throughout the years. And so I've put them here. And yeah, we'll just dive in. The first one is from Hosea chapter 3. It says, "Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of trouble a door of hope. And there she will respond as in the days of her youth, singing, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. This is from Isaiah. Although the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, your teachers will be hidden no more. With your own eyes you will see them. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." This one is from John. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus said, "I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it to the fullest." For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. It's also from Jeremiah. And here's the last one. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. For I am the Lord, your God, who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, "Do not fear, I will help you." And that's from Isaiah 41. So, anyway, there's my testimony. Thanks for listening.